Headless humanoid apparition. One night in August of 1947, three men, Julian Sendin, Marcelo Martin, and Fausto Sanchez were returning back to the village carrying contraband food and stopped for a brief rest on an isolated field. Suddenly, the men began to hear what seemed to be a mixture of several musical instruments playing at the same time, without order, along with voices of people singing and dancing, also without order. It soon became a cacophony of unintelligible sounds. The men became restless as the sound approached them. Suddenly, all three fell silent, dropped their sacks on the floor, and were unable to take another step. Walking in their direction was a gigantic figure, which seemed to swing its arms like a soldier. The figure was wearing a white shirt with a black necktie. Looking up, they noticed that the figure appeared to be headless. The music seemed to originate from the creature's body. Trembling with fear, the men sank to the ground, praying that the strange figure would pass by without noticing their presence. Strangely, the creature ignored the men and kept on walking until it disappeared in the distance. Following this incident, the men refused to go out on any night runs. It will come over the hill. One evening in 1940, as she was talking to her husband, Mrs. Smith said out of the blue, "It will come over the hill when it comes." After that, she had no recollection of ever saying that phrase, even though her husband insisted that she had. Shortly afterwards, she became nervous about staying in the house after dark. About 3 months later, she woke her husband up and told him that the thing from over the hill was nearly upon them. The Smiths heard the outside door opening and heard a heavy, wet tread on the stairs. As they clung to each other, the door swung open and the thing waddled in. The thing was bloated and naked, with skin blotched green, yellow, and purple. It had a head that almost came to a point at the top, long earlobes that nearly reached its shoulders, webbed feet, and a thick bull neck. It moved towards the window, where it then vanished. While recalling the incident, Mrs. Smith said this: "It was horrible and the absolute essence of evil. I've never experienced anything so dreadful before or since, and I hope I never shall, God willing. I still experience the same horror when I talk about it, or write about it as I'm doing now. I've never been able to discover why I saw it, and I've never been able to find out what it was." Wyoming Zombies. The witness, NG, is a truck driver in North America. NG claims to have seen something horrific as he was driving along the desolate Interstate 80 in Wyoming. As NG was driving along Interstate 80, a thick fog suddenly rolled up out of nowhere, at which point he slowed down and continued driving. NG then saw a figure staggering away from what appeared to be a broken down vehicle on the shoulder of the road. Just as NG was about to stop and call 911, he saw a chunk of flesh fall from the figure's face, before it turned and stared with bright red eyes. At the time, NG was driving at 5 miles per hour, but quickly sped up to 45 miles per hour, when he saw 20 or 30 other humanoids walking along the interstate, with bright red eyes and rotten flesh. NG didn't stop until he reached Fort Bridger, where the fog had cleared up. There, NG saw an army convoy, which had been braking at the truck stop, head off in the direction of these zombies. A few fellow truckers have told NG that the entities he saw were called the Wyoming Zombie Walkers, and they will wander any given stretch of highway in search of their next human victim. The Horse-man of Lincolnshire. Mr. K was driving down the back road from Great Yarmouth to Lincoln. The area was dark and rural, with lots of trees around. As Mr. K drove down, he noticed to his right a shape which looked like a horse or deer. As the thing got closer, Mr. K was shocked at what it actually was. It had the body and legs of a horse, but the face of a man. Mr. K described it as scary and unpleasant, and sped out of there, not looking back. When he got home, he told his wife and friends about what he'd seen, but most of them laughed and told him he was imagining things. However, Mr. K insisted that he'd actually seen it, and it wasn't a horse or deer. Dog-headed men. One evening, Mark, who was about 9, was walking along a sidewalk when he saw 3 people walking towards him who seemed to be somewhat taller than normal people. They were dressed in suits, but had very large dogs' heads. Their heads swayed widely from side to side as they walked. Mark was absolutely terrified as they approached, but they seemed not to notice him as they walked past, and he passed by them safely. Mark immediately rushed home and told his brother of his encounter. Cutout Man. Andy recalls that while walking home at 6 a.m. with a friend in a suburb in southeast London, they saw a figure walking up the streets towards them. The figure was walking in a weird, kind of up and down bouncy walk. It took a few seconds for Andy and his friend to realize that the figure wasn't human. "See that man?" Andy asked. "Yes," his friend answered. "It's not a man though, is it?" said Andy, to which his friend replied, "No, it isn't." The creature was entirely black, and like a cardboard cutout, flat and one-dimensional. It had no features at all, and arms that hung down to its knees. The creature seemed to ignore Andy and his friend, but once it noticed them, it began moving towards them. They both ran and hid in Andy's house, until the creature turned around and left. Weird-looking old man. In Coventry, England, a UFO investigator, Brian Leslie Andrew, terminated his UFO activities after suffering a series of bizarre encounters in the fall of 1968. One October evening, while returning home, Brian encountered something strange. He was alone, and noticed that a man was standing by the next-door garage. Nobody had been there before. The man's face was glowing orange, and as Brian watched, the man's face changed to that of an old man right in front of his eyes. Brian described the first face as something that wasn't normal. It had eyes, a nose, and mouth in the proper places, but not of the shape that is associated with the human figure. Soon after the entity vanished, Brian started experiencing problems with his telephone. Whenever he'd speak to someone about this encounter, the phone would go dead. When he didn't bring up the subject, the telephone seemed to work normally. Brian has also had problems with local power failures and received threatening phone calls, which has led to him ceasing all UFO-related activity. MIB Visit. On April 25, 1978, UFO researcher Pat Delafreniere, a member of the Canadian UFO Research Centre, was at her office going over some detailed UFO reports that she wanted to present on a local UFO program, when there was a sudden knock on the door. Where her office is located, she could hear everyone coming in the main door, being admitted, then walking down the hall. However, this knock came out of nowhere. When she opened the door, she was greeted with a very odd-looking man. He was dressed entirely in black. He was about 5'6", extremely thin, with a slightly enlarged head. His hair was just nubs, as if he had been completely shaved, and the hair was just growing back. His skin also had a strange olive hue. His lips were very thin, and his cheeks were so sunken in that they looked like they were pinned on the inside. His eyes were dark and extremely long, wrapping around his temple. Pat stated that she'd never seen eyes like that, and that they bore into her. The man just stood there and didn't move, while Pat was fixated on his eyes, as she felt intruded upon on a mental level. Finally, after a full minute, the man spoke. He said, "Would you like a photograph of your family?" A question Pat considered strange. What was even stranger was the man's voice. It was low and hesitant, and he had no conception of how to speak, or how to put a sentence together. According to Pat, the man's English was impeccable though, but it seemed that he was struggling to just get through the sentence. Pat then answered, "No, I have enough pictures," to which the man then stepped back, turned around and disappeared. Pat later discovered that many of her papers and files had gone missing. Green Man. One summer afternoon in 2007, Nick was returning home from central London, while his train had remained idle for some time at the New Malden station. While lost in thought, Nick was looking out the window when he saw something that made him audibly gasp. At the far end of the platform was a thick bank of trees and bushes behind a fence. Suddenly, what appeared to be an enormous face started forming from the surrounding greenery, very similar to the Green Man seen in church carvings. The face was about 5 feet wide and about 7 feet from the ground. Nick gazed at the face for 20 seconds, before suddenly and with immense speed, The entire face withdrew backwards into the vegetation, causing the surrounding bushes and trees to sway violently. What was even stranger was that a branch supposedly under the face swung upwards with immense force before smacking down again, reassuming its original position within the greenery. According to Nick, the face in no way looked man-made or constructed. The features were clear to see, including its grinning mouth and glaring eyes. This was the first and only time Nick had seen this green man. Tiny humans. 5 young men were returning to the goat pens in a local farm when they saw 6 short, bizarre humanoids emerge from behind some nearby bush. The humanoids were about 1 foot tall, completely hairless, with dark gray skin. They had huge oval-shaped heads, large pointed ears, and black oval-shaped eyes. The humanoids also had large deformed noses and disproportionately big mouths. The men also reported that the humanoids had yellow teeth, with some even missing a few. They also appeared to be sporting a grotesque and sarcastic grin on their faces. They looked almost human, and had multiple scars and cuts on their skin. Most of the humanoids had protruding bellies, and wore similar dirty outfits. They moved around in weird jumps, since they seemed to have very short legs. The humanoids seemed to be play fighting for a few minutes, and some of them even stared at the men and emitted sinister laughs, which frightened the young men. After play fighting for a few minutes, one of the humanoids approached the sheep pen. Frightened, the sheep grouped together into one corner of the pen. Suddenly, the humanoid jumped on the sheep, digging his sharp claws into its neck, before the remaining 5 humanoids joined in, knocking over the sheep and continuing the attack. The 5 men were frozen in place as they watched the spectacle unfold. However, one of the men came to his senses and began flinging rocks on the humanoids. The humanoids were laughing mockingly as they evaded the rocks, but this seemed to work, causing the creatures to regroup and disappear into the bushes they came from. Computer-generated person. Mr. GP, a professor in the University of Patras in Greece, was watching TV at night in his home, while his son and wife were asleep in their rooms. When he turned off the TV, he noticed that the kitchen light was still on, and so went to turn it off. When he did, he felt a cold chill. When he turned around, he came face to face with a tall and lanky humanoid, dressed in blue overalls. The humanoid had vague human features, with bumps where facial features should have been. Mr. GP described the creature as looking like something computer-generated. The creature then started moving in great leaps, which Mr. GP described as similar to the leaps of hurdles athletes, but in slow motion. It left the kitchen and rushed towards the bathroom. When Mr. GP followed behind, he found that it had disappeared, and this time was coming out of one of the bedrooms. Then finally it disappeared again, and came out from the living room, before vanishing into thin air, where it was not seen again. Mr. GP was shocked throughout the whole encounter, and believed the creature was running from something, although he was not sure what. Giant shrimp. Virginia Staples described her encounter that occurred in her apartment in Bremerton, Washington in 1948. Virginia lived in an apartment with a huge basement, with huge holes in the walls. The apartment house manager used to tell her that it was rumored that these holes contained a passage to a body of water. Her apartment had a washer, a clothesline, and a washtub in the basement. One particular day while Virginia had hung up all her clothes, she felt someone staring at her. When she finally turned around and looked towards the back of the basement, she froze. In one of the huge holes stood this thing, which Virginia described as horrible. The thing stood at 5 feet tall, as tall as her. It had a bright orange-colored body, little spidery thin legs, and antenna on its head that kept on moving in and out. The thing then started moving towards Virginia, who panicked and rushed out the door. Later, Virginia packed up her stuff and left the apartment, moving over to Seattle to her cousin's place. Virginia claimed to have later gone to an aquarium to try and find anything that looked like the creature she saw. The only thing she could find, which seemed even remotely similar, was a shrimp. Virginia claimed to have had nightmares for years following this incident. When she finally got the courage to revisit her old apartment, she found that it had been torn down. Man in a human suit. An anonymous user on the Forteana forums described an encounter she had in 2003. the user was called on by their mother. When they went downstairs to answer her, they found a man at the front door. According to the user, the man didn't look right. His hair, skin, and clothes seemed to be on sideways. The user could only describe it as if the man had put on a human suit that morning, which didn't fit in very well. The man then looked at the user and asked if they could take him down to the gas station since he had run out of gas. The man's car was sitting on the shoulder of the road. Afraid of riding alone in the car with the man, the user offered to go and get the gas for him while he waited in his car. The man then proceeded to hand the user $10 and went off to wait. The user then drove to the gas station and came back with the gas to give to the man. The man then proceeded to fill his car. However, he seemed to spill half of it on the road. He then told the user to keep the change before heading off. Following this encounter, the user and their mother had a huge discussion about it, in which she agreed that the man somehow seemed off, like he wasn't human. They also lamented on how weird it was that he'd passed a gas station to get to their house and hadn't thought of getting gas while he was there. Verde Creature. On October 1973, in La Verde, Puerto Rico, Ana Dominguez and Jose Alomar, accompanied by their daughter and several others, were visiting an area near where their youngest son, Jose Jr., had mysteriously disappeared 3 months before. While Jose was in a nearby ranch house, Ana and her daughter stayed in the car, which was parked near the road, waiting for him to come back. Suddenly, from the left side of the car, they both heard what they thought was Jose's voice, saying loud and clear, "Open the car door, I'm back." The voice repeated the same thing again, and suddenly the girl pointed at something outside the car. Ana then saw a terrifying-looking being standing outside the car, leaning on the windshield and looking in. The creature was described as tall, thin, with a huge egg-shaped head, long pointy ears, and 2 huge black oval-shaped eyes. The being was leaning on the windshield and had placed a hand on it. The hand was long and skinny, with 3 long fingers, somehow resembling those of a chicken claw. No other facial features could be seen, since it was dark outside. Both witnesses, now in a panic, began screaming and pushing on the car horn. When Jose and the rest arrived, the strange being had disappeared. To this day, both mother and daughter are convinced that the voice they heard had been that of Jose Alomar. Puppet People. Clarence tells of an encounter that took place in New Orleans in 1991. At the time, Clarence was 7 years old and pretending to be sick, so he could stay home from school. He was lying on the sofa in his grandparents' living room when he heard his grandmother coming down the stairs and entering the den. He pretended to be asleep while she shuffled for her things and left through the attached rec room. Clarence then heard a creak coming from the rec room and opened his eyes. From the couch he was sitting on, Clarence could clearly see into the rec room. Across from him, on the far wall of the room, was a toy closet. As Clarence lay there, he saw the closet door slowly opening, and a voice distinctly whispered, "Is she gone?" The first figure leaned out of the closet. He was shorter than the doorknob, and looked like a Sesame Street character. Fuzzy light pink skin, a shiny black nose, big cartoonish eyes, and a tuft of troll doll-like hair atop his football-shaped head. The little figure didn't seem to be puppeteered by anyone, and his legs were clearly visible. Clarence was fascinated by this sight, and wanted to take a closer look, but hesitated when he heard the voice of the second figure, a grunt affirming the first one's question. Clarence described the second figure's voice as downright disturbing, claiming that people don't normally sound like that. The first puppet exited the closet, and his nearly identical companion followed closely behind. They hurried behind the rec room's wraparound sofa. Curious, Clarence crawled behind them on the floor, trying not to make a sound. The first puppet was bent over, looking at something behind the sofa. When Clarence got close enough, he patted the back of the puppet, and in a timid whisper, said, "Hey." Instantly, the puppet turned around, glaring at him, and came out from behind the sofa, bringing them face to face. The puppet then darted out a hand, and pinched Clarence's arm hard enough to break the skin, and cause a small scab to form on his forearm. Frightened, Clarence rushed outside and waited on the lawn until his grandmother came back. As his grandmother started to scold him for pretending to be sick, she noticed the scab on his arm. Clarence then broke down and told her a condensed version of the events that had occurred. However, she insisted that it must have been nothing more than a bad dream. To this day, Clarence still debates whether he was simply crazy, or if he'd actually seen these puppet people. Weird-headed people. In about 1990 or 1991, after finishing a movie, James was driving two of his friends back home. It was around 2 a.m. and raining heavily. As they approached a roundabout, James and his friends noticed something unusual. A white Toyota saloon parked right in the middle of the roundabout, on the grass center. They thought the car was stolen and abandoned, since it had no accident damage. They then noticed two strange occupants inside the car. Both occupants had huge heads, one which looked like a giant upright raisin, with no obvious features, and one whose head was shaped like the continent of Africa. Both had on dark sunglasses, and were looking straight ahead. Their heads seemed to be dark and leathery in texture. Jack and his friends were unsure of what they'd seen, since it was dark and raining heavily. However, they circled the roundabout twice to get a better look, confirming that that's what they'd actually seen. Vegetable Man. In mid-July 1968, Jennings Frederick was out hunting when he heard a high-pitched jabbering. The voice, which he believed to have heard telepathically, seemed to say, "You need not fear me. I wish to communicate. I come as friends. We know of you all. I wish medical assistance. I need your help." As Jennings placed his hand in his pocket, trying to pull out a handkerchief, he found it was entangled with what he thought were brambles. Withdrawing his arm, he saw attached to it a thin, flexible hand and arm, green in color like a plant. The hand had 3 fingers, each ending in needle-like tips and suction cups. The grip on Jennings' arm seemed to tighten, and a blood vessel was punctured. As he turned around, he saw a terrifying being with semi-human facial features. It had slanting yellow eyes and pointed ears, and a body like the stalk of some huge ungainly plant. The creature's eyes suddenly spun, momentarily hypnotizing Jennings. As the pain in his arm subsided, Jennings remained frozen until the transfusion, which lasted a minute, was complete. He was then released and the creature departed into the woods. Bunny Man. The witness, FP, claims to have had a paranormal encounter with the same person twice in the past 6 months. FP asserts that he has never had hallucinations and is of sound mind. The first encounter took place in October, when FP was walking his dog at 3 a.m. FP claims that his dog is hyper-aware of everything and barks at doors shutting, or a bird landing near him. While standing on his back deck, he saw a figure moving down the dark alley, which was unusual, considering FP rarely saw anyone else out at this time, especially since it was raining heavily. He looked over and saw what appeared to be a man wearing a full-body bunny costume, describing it as similar to the character in Donnie Darko. The man was about 200 to 300 feet away, and was walking in a manner that was unnatural and unsettling, stomping and swaying from side to side very mechanically, with an arched back. After about 5 seconds, the man sensed that FP was looking at him, and turned around. FP could not tell whether the man was wearing a mask, but he was sure that it was not a human face. FP turned around and started pulling on his dog's leash, trying to get him to go inside. The dog, however, was unaware of the bunny man, and didn't bark. Within 10 seconds, FP looked back in the direction of the bunny man, who now seemed to be staring from behind a tree in the neighbor's yard. This was about 50 feet away from FP, which was strange, as it would not have been humanly possible for the bunny man to cover that distance in the short time FP had turned around. A few months after that incident, while walking his dog, FP saw the bunny man again, peeking his head around a corner. This time, FP's dog barked at him, proving that it wasn't just a hallucination. FP didn't get a proper look at the man's face, but could only make out his large, dark eyes and a terrifying grin. The Night Visit. Scottish author Richard Curl had a strange encounter as a kid in his childhood home in Scotland. One night, Curl was sleeping in an isolated room on the second floor of the house, When at about 2 in the morning, he awoke, but he lay still in his bed, looking outside the window. Suddenly, he could hear footsteps coming from outside. The footsteps were steady and unhurried. The sound of the footsteps came closer, first passing through the back courtyard of the house, which was supposedly bolted, and continuing unhindered, until they'd reached the back of the house. Then he heard the footsteps inside the house itself, which frightened him. The footsteps continued up the stairs, until they stopped just outside Curl's room. Frightened, Curl stood upright in his bed, as the doorknob turned, revealing the source of the footsteps. Standing in the middle of the door was a figure with the face of a fox that appeared to stand on 2 legs. The figure was wearing clothes and also appeared to be wearing a top hat. Curl could also see a bushy tail behind the figure. The fox-like figure stared directly at Curl, and left right as Curl shouted the words, "Go away," leaving the same way it came in, until the footsteps were no longer heard. Centipede Man. OP posted a strange encounter he had with a so-called Centipede Man on the Humanoid Encounters subreddit. The encounter happened in Rio Grande, Brazil in 2012. OP's mother had rented the house of a friend, which they used to enjoy a couple of days at the beach. One day, OP had the house all for himself, since his mother and sisters had all gone out for the day. Frightened by the idea of staying alone in this 2-story house, OP decided he'd go out and look for his mom. He jumped over the fence and walked around town for a bit, but after a while realized that he was lost. He had no idea where he was, and no idea where his mom was. Even though he knew where she'd be going, he didn't know how to get there. OP gave up on finding his mom, and decided instead to go back home, but also didn't know how to get there. There weren't many people out at this time, and OP was scared to ask for directions from the few he saw. Eventually, OP saw a dirt path which resembled the one in front of his house, and so decided to continue on it, walking around until he found a beach. While at the beach, OP could see someone moving behind the big spiky rocks on the shore, and then the person came out. The thing looked like an adult man, with legs and feet, but it didn't seem to be human. The biggest proof of that was its left arm, which OP described to be a huge centipede extending to the ground. He could see all of its little legs moving around. That wasn't the only weird thing about the man. OP described him as looking like Oogie Boogie from The Nightmare Before Christmas, but with normal human skin and an egg-shaped head. OP was frightened and bolted out of there. On the path, one of his sisters found him, since they'd been looking for him for a while. Green Baby. On the spring of 1977, Dawn Finch was walking home from the town center of Borehamwood where she lived. On her way home, there was a smallish man-made lake, surrounded by a park. As she reached the end of the lake, she saw an elderly couple staring into the water. Dawn stopped to see what they were looking at. In the middle of the lake was what seemed to be a light green baby, which seemed to be fixed in place in the flowing patch of water. It was the same size of a normal baby, but its head seemed to be larger than normal. At first, Dawn believed it to be a doll covered in algae. Other people started gathering around the lake, including Dawn's sister, concerned that it was a real baby stuck inside. As they all watched, the baby suddenly moved. This seemed to anger the crowd, believing it now to be a real baby, not a doll. After a few minutes, Dawn's sister left, as one of the crowd members ran to find a phone booth to call the police. In the 15 minutes it took for the police and ambulance to arrive, the baby continued to move slowly, tilting its head and lifting its arm. No one seemed to be willing to go into the water because of how dirty it was. But after some discussion, one of the ambulance crew went in after the baby. The crowd grew even bigger as the man pushed through the lake towards the baby. However, just as he was an arm's length away from the baby, it vanished, sinking underwater. 2 policemen followed into the lake with sticks, poking around underwater looking for the baby. This continued for a while, but they weren't able to find the baby. By then the crowd had dispersed and Dawn went home. Dawn believes that this might have all been a prank, since the special effects industry in Borehamwood was big at the time, so the baby could have somehow been remote controlled from a distance. The people of the hill. Kimberly describes a strange encounter she had when she was around 15 in Western Australia. She states that indigenous customs and traditions are different from those in the wider country. When people in the community do wrong things, they are punished in ways other than the Australian legal system. The punishment is administered by the elders on the land, typically around the end of the year. Kimberly starts by explaining that her second cousin, who lived across from her house, was always fighting. One night, when Kimberly and her aunt were on the porch talking, her cousin came home drunk and passed out in the house. It was very late at night when the wind suddenly stopped, and the temperature dropped. Something was off, but Kimberly knew that it wasn't meant for them. Then, the silhouette of the tallest, darkest, skinniest man Kimberly had ever seen climbed down from the enormous gum tree in her cousin's yard, as though he had been there for some time, waiting for her cousin's return. The man was very old and towered over the street lights. He also wore a red band on his forehead. The man then approached the house, standing over it, before lifting the roof clean off without making a sound. He then went inside, and after a short while, climbed out the same way he came in, placing the roof back on the house before leaving for the hill. Kimberly claims that they avoid the hill because it gives off bad energy. As if nothing had happened, Kimberly and her aunt looked at each other for a while, before going to sleep. According to Kimberly, she wasn't surprised, since she had seen something like this before, when she was much younger. They call them the people of the hill, and they're always watching. Apparently, her grandfather used to speak with them. The next morning, Kimberly found out that her cousin had had a fight with her father earlier that night, which is why the man from the hill paid her a visit. Following that night, Kimberly's cousin refused to speak of the incident, and has totally given up drinking. Cadman. A man named Zolmerman had left for work early in the morning, and had taken his usual road through Limeira in Sao Paulo, Brazil. There was a weak fog that morning. While driving, Zolmerman noticed a person who appeared to be hitchhiking, and even though aware of the dangers, he stopped near the person. The person approached the driver's seat. When he took a closer look, Zolmerman realized that he wasn't a person. He had human-like characteristics, but he had large, cat-like eyes, and exuded a powerful odor. The person then pointed to the direction of Piracicaba and entered the car. As he entered the back seat, Zolmerman could not stand the smell, claiming that it was unlike anything known to him. The person was about 5'2", with pale features, and he seemed to be wearing a hood and a jogging outfit. Zolmerman noticed a small nose, but no hair on the person. He then proceeded to ask the person for his name, who in turn looked at him. As he did, his pupils turned totally black. After driving less than a mile, Zolmerman began hearing strange croaking sounds which seemed to come from the person. Looking down, he noticed that the person had 6-fingered hands with pointy black nails. His skin appeared to be sweating some type of oily substance, from which the smell emanated. Each time Zolmerman would ask him something, his pupils would turn completely black. As they were near the person's destination, Zolmerman felt that he had to stop the car, and so he did. The man then exited the car, quickly disappearing into some bushes. Humanoid Spider. On the Humanoid Encounters subreddit, OP posted a strange encounter with a being he described as a humanoid spider. OP was about 6 at the time of his encounter, and him and his brother had just cleaned their room, an achievement they were proud of. It had only been a day or two when they heard footsteps in the middle of the night. Assuming it was their father, they thought nothing of it. The footsteps sounded like steel-capped boots walking through the hallway near the back door. Then the footsteps led to OP's room, but there was no one there. The spider then came down from the top of the doorway and slowly moved towards the wardrobe, violently pulling clothes from it. It had a human face. Through the chaos, OP called out to his brother on the top of the bunk bed, asking if he was awake, to which he replied that he was. OP then asked his brother if he could see the spider, to which he went quiet for a moment, before replying that he could. In the morning, OP's brother told him to forget about the encounter, since no one would believe them, and there's nothing they could do about it. OP claims that the spider was maintaining eye contact the entire time, but he wasn't sure how it left the room, because he had hid under the blanket for most of the encounter. The Man from the Box. On an Ask Reddit thread asking users about the creepiest thing they've ever experienced, a Reddit user described their eerie encounter. When the user was 16, he would jump on the trampoline for hours every night while listening to his iPod and daydreaming, as a way to escape his rough family life. One night, while on the trampoline, he notices a kid running past their fence at full speed, carrying a box about the shape and size of a skateboard. The kid stops at the park behind the user's house and proceeds to throw the box into the air, which flips a few times before landing on the ground. The kid stares at the box for a while, before running back past the user's fence, not noticing he was there. The user continues staring at the box, when out of nowhere it starts moving. Something then starts to rise out of the box. The user was in disbelief, and watched as what looked like a full-grown man rises out of the box, which was 2 inches thick. The man had an elongated head with no hair. His skin was orange, and his eyes were huge and pitch black. The man then raises one arm to his side and places the box into what seems to be his trench coat. The man then walks over to the only pavilion in the park, grabs the metal beam holding up the overhang, and proceeds to bang his head on it over and over. At this point, the user was frightened, unable to move. Then, without warning, the man just stops and turns towards the user, as if he could feel he was watching him. The man then flashes him a giant smile, as his dark eyes stare at him. The user then starts to tear up, before the man phases down off the road into the distance. The user then sprints home and calls his best friend, who reassures him that he was imagining things. However, the user still believes that what he saw was real.